Thank you all for coming. Unfortunately, I don't know enough about the healthcare system of this country to say anything meaningful about the debates that you're having here, but Martin and Richard have told me that in the debate here, a possible solution that sometimes comes up is the idea of introducing something like the British National Health Service, and if that's the argument, then, well, I'm going to say, don't do it, that's a really bad idea. Whatever problems your system may have, that's going to make it worse. So first of all, I should say that I don't have a medical background. I don't know anything about clinical issues. That's why I never talk about any of those. I look at this simply as an economist. That's my background. It's as an economist, and I look at health economics, I look at different healthcare systems, and what an economist might possibly be able to contribute to that. My starting point is quite simply, I just start from the presumption that healthcare is ultimately not that different from other parts of the economy. So of course, healthcare has some special features, but it's not so radically different that to justify organizing it in a completely different way from any other sector of the economy. It's not that everything we know about economics suddenly stops being true as soon as we talk about healthcare. It's not that healthcare is some sort of parallel universe where you have different laws of physics and gravity or whatever. I say healthcare is ultimately a sector of the economy pretty much like any other, and it should therefore be organized in a similar way. In most parts of the economy, we want a degree of competition, we want a degree of consumer sovereignty, we want consumers to be able to make free choices, and we want providers to respond to those choices. We want those providers who do that to do well, and the ones that do badly, well, we want them to lose business or, in the worst case, even go out of business. And why is that the case? Why do we normally think that that is a better way to organize economic activity than, say, central planning or whatever else the alternative may be? Well, let me start with a quote from the Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek, who is an indirect founding father of the institute that I work for. He wrote a lot about this. He was a critic of centrally planned economies, so this is something that's probably obvious to you, because this was obviously a planned economy 30 years ago, and there is a reason why it isn't anymore. Hayek said that the peculiar character of the problem of rational economic order is determined precisely by the fact that the knowledge of the circumstances of which we must make use never exists in concentrated or integrated form, but solely as the dispersed bits of incomplete and frequently contradictory knowledge which all the separate individuals possess. And he also talked about the role of competition in 1968. He said wherever we make use of competition, this can only be justified by our not knowing the essential circumstances that determine the behavior of the competitors. It would be patently absurd to sponsor a contest if we knew in advance who the winner would be. So the problem with Hayek is that he was not a very clear writer. So I'll try to sum this up. What did he mean by all that? We don't know from the outset how to organize a successful industry, right? Nobody has the knowledge, the knowledge that would be required to set up a successful industry and in whatever field that may be. We can only experiment with a number of different things and find out through trial and error. That was the Hayekian insight. So no central planner can ever know enough to just set up a functioning industry, let alone an entire economy from scratch. What we have to do, what we need is a process of trial and error, a process of experimentation, where different people do different things, and then we just work out, we just figure out over time what works and what doesn't. And this trial and error competition process needs to be combined with, in order to make that work, you need radical decentralization. You need a system in which the different actors can do things very differently. You may have different business models in competition with one another. Say, one highly specialized business model where somebody says, I only do one thing, versus a more integrated business model where somebody says, no, I'm more like a supermarket, I do a range of things at once, and just let all of those models compete with each other, and then we figure out which is the best and what works under what circumstances. Because in that way, a system like that is going to be able to make use of the knowledge that the various market participants have. And that's often a type of knowledge that is that people possess. Somebody may have a business idea, somebody may have an idea for how to organize something, how to run something, but they would probably struggle to articulate it. It's often something that it's a kind of knowledge which people possess but can't easily put into words, and therefore it cannot be collected in centralized form. We just need the freedom of individual actors to do their own thing, and then let's see what works. That was the Hayekian insight. He was talking about economies in general rather than specifically about healthcare. But as I said, healthcare is ultimately not that different from any other sector of the economy. It has some special features, but they don't justify organizing healthcare in a totally different way. So where does healthcare differ from, say, producing chocolate bars? Well, there is firstly the issue of universality. In many other parts of the economy, we are not that bothered if there is inequality, if some people can, say, go to nicer restaurants than others, or have a nicer holiday or something like that. If there's inequality in most parts of the economy, we're not that troubled by that. In healthcare, most of us would have a problem with it. If, say, the quality of the healthcare you get depends directly on your ability to pay. We want a system in which even poor people can access whatever is medically necessary, but then that is not an un-Hayekian notion. That is something that can be integrated in a market-based healthcare system. That is not something that Hayek, even though he didn't write about healthcare, that is not something that he would have had a problem with. Secondly, there's the issue of information asymmetries. So you will sometimes find the argument that markets work fine when we're talking about a product that the consumer understands well. So you know what chocolate bars you like and which ones you don't like, so you just pick the ones that you like, and the ones that you don't like, you leave them in the store, and that's all it takes. In healthcare, it's a bit trickier because you're probably not going to know from the outside, is this a good doctor or is this a bad doctor? Is this a good hospital or is this a bad hospital? There, the information is much more complex, and whoever provides the service knows much more about the product than you do. So there is this information asymmetry, and that's sometimes an argument that's used against markets in healthcare. But I'd say that is not so special, really, that argument. Information asymmetries exist in lots of different sectors of the economy, and normally that's not a massive problem. If we think about technology, so this phone here, I have no idea how this works. I couldn't explain it. I don't know what makes it good or bad, but nonetheless, this is from a trusted brand, and therefore I just know, well, if the company that makes it, if they produce a shoddy product, okay, maybe they make a profit in the short term, but then if their reputation suffers, ultimately they go out of business, and that is a way in which markets overcome information asymmetries. That's why it's not a problem in most sectors, and it doesn't need to be a problem in healthcare either. Then there's the issue of, we talked about this just on the podcast. You will sometimes hear the argument that in healthcare, it's wrong to be motivated by profit because it means that you are profiting from other people's sickness. Well, firstly, you could say this you could make a similar argument about many other parts of the economy. You could say the baker profits from people's hunger. Isn't that immoral? But there we don't have a problem with it. And secondly, even in a nationalized healthcare system, even if the state provides healthcare, it is still true that the individual doctors, the individual actors in the system benefit from other people's sickness, because if nobody ever got sick, there would be no doctors, right? That's true in any system, whether that's state-run, private, or something in between. So this is true in any system, and therefore not much of an argument. And fourthly, there's an argument that one person's health has an impact on other people's health. So if we think about the pandemic, the last time I was in this country was in the very early stages of the pandemic of COVID-19. That would be a good example where it would be fair to say, okay, healthcare isn't just an individual matter. I may make my choices about healthcare, but the trouble is, if I catch a virus, well, it's not just my problem. I'm passing it on to other people, so therefore externalities. And that's true when we're talking about a literal pandemic. It's true if we talk about infectious diseases, so healthcare in the 19th century, in the times of early industrialization, had those aspects of contagious diseases, mostly where it wasn't so much an individual matter, but a matter for everybody. However, nowadays, if we look at what healthcare systems do nowadays, they mostly deal with chronic conditions, with cancer, with respiratory problems. That is not like public health at all. So the public health part, the part where you clearly have spillover effects, where one person's behavior has a strong effect on other people's behavior, that's a very small part nowadays of the health sector. So you can say, well, in times of a pandemic, fair enough, there we can have public interventions, but that's not a reason for state-run nationalized healthcare under normal conditions. So much for the economics of healthcare. Let's have a look at what types of healthcare systems actually exist in Europe. So you could say the healthcare systems in Europe come in basically 3 different varieties. And although that is an oversimplification, in reality there's variation within each type and there are overlaps between them, but as a starting point, that's one way to make sense of it. One type of healthcare system is the so-called the state-run health service, where you have the tax collector collects money, gives it to an organization that runs the hospitals, runs clinics, contracts doctors, and so forth. The National Health Service in Britain would be one of those examples, but this can also be done on a regional or on a local basis. So parts of Scandinavia have local health services, tax-funded. Much of the Mediterranean, Italy, Spain, they have regional health services. So you have provincial governments running their health services. That's one way of organizing healthcare. The other one is the so-called national insurance system or public insurance system, where you have a state health insurer. So that is like a monopoly company, a publicly owned state monopoly that finances healthcare. That organization collects health insurance contributions from everybody, or everybody who can pay for them, and then pays for most healthcare. That's the system in France, but also in Canada, Australia, a couple of other places. So in this system, you don't have competition between health insurers. It's just one, you can't opt out, but you can have competition between different healthcare providers. So this organization, this national health insurer, would not own hospitals. It would not directly employ doctors. It just reimburses the money. It finances healthcare, but it is not itself a healthcare provider. And then we have social insurance systems. That's a system which, from what I've heard, the reforms here, 2004 to 2006, were aiming towards. That's a system where you have multiple healthcare payers, healthcare financing agencies. You can choose which one you want. And you have different competing healthcare providers. And in practice, though, these systems, the differences between these systems are not as clear-cut. You can show it that way in a PowerPoint presentation. You can put them in separate boxes. In practice, they overlap because, for example, there are systems that are technically state-run health services. So Italy, for example, has regional health services. Each province runs its own health service, but they don't do everything themselves. They do buy services from the private sector. And that's, in fact, a pretty big part of it. More than a third of healthcare in Italy is provided by the private sector. And when you have a tax-funded health service which outsources a lot of things, you could say, well, isn't this health service then just like a national insurance organization? So in practice, they overlap. And in the same way, you could say, in a system like the British National Health Service, well, even there is a separation between the organizations that actually provide the healthcare, the hospitals and clinics and surgeries, and the organizations that allocate money to them. So that's even though they're both part of the NHS, they're technically separate organizations. So you could say, well, this idea that you have an insurer that just pays different providers, but it doesn't itself run healthcare facilities, that exists there as well. And similarly here, that difference isn't clear-cut either, because there are systems, for example, in neighboring Austria. They have multiple health insurers, but you can't choose between them. So it's not your choice who your health insurer is. And from what I know, there are no big differences between them. So there you could say, well, isn't this a bit of an illusion? Okay, you may have different organizations, they may have different names, they may have different addresses, there may be different people working for them, but ultimately, if they all do the same thing, isn't this just like having a national insurer? So in practice, the differences here are not so clear-cut. And if we want to know, are these systems, which of these systems are the most market-oriented, which are the most competitive, Hayekian ones? Well, at first sight, you could say, well, that's clearly the social insurance systems. There you have the competing insurers, you have the competing providers. Isn't this market-like? Well, it's not so clear. It depends on the specifics, depends on the details. So if you have a system where you have, say, 5, 10, 20, or 100 different health insurers, but they all do the same thing because the government tells them what to do, then, well, that's not very Hayekian. That's not much of a market process. That's not much of a competition process. And similarly, even in these systems here, which look very socialist at first sight, this looks like the least Hayekian type of system. Well, even there, you can have competitive elements. So in the British National Health Service, you can choose between different NHS hospitals, and depending on the choices you make, the money or some of the money follows you. So if you choose Hospital A rather than Hospital B, Hospital A gets more money than Hospital B, and they have some autonomy. So you can have some competitive elements even in this system, and even systems of that variety can be very non-competitive. So it would be wrong to say these are the market systems, these are the socialist systems, that's somewhere in between. It depends on the specifics, depends on how you want to organize them. Now, let's have a quick look at some of the outcomes that the different systems produce. Comparing healthcare systems by outcomes is a tricky business. It's not very clear-cut. There's no obvious measure of success or failure. So to ask, is this system better than that system? That would be a bit like asking, does Slovakia brew better beer than the Czech Republic? Well, it depends firstly on what kind of beer you like and on which ones you're trying. Different breweries make different kinds of beers for different tastes, so there's no obvious measure of success or failure, but nonetheless, it's not entirely subjective either. We can narrow it down a little bit. One fairly obvious measure which tells us something about healthcare is this measure here, an estimate of avoidable deaths. So an estimate of how many people are dying whose life could have been saved by better healthcare or faster healthcare. So avoidable deaths per 100,000 people. This is from just before the pandemic. It's because for most countries it hasn't been updated and it might be a bit distorted if we look at more recent data. But what we see here is, firstly, Britain with the National Health Service is not doing brilliantly. So the highest or second highest rate of avoidable deaths in Western Europe. That's not great. We also see there's a massive East-West gap still between Eastern and Western Europe. That is clearly a historical legacy. And that gap is closing. So I'm guessing in 10 years, this will look very different. 10 years ago, that East-West gap would have been a lot larger than it is today. But for now, it is still there. It's closing, but it's still there. We can see Slovakia here. That is not great by Western European standards, but compared to the neighbor countries, that's not bad. The Czech Republic, perhaps the best in Eastern Europe so far, at least on this measure. And we can see the Netherlands, Switzerland, some of the systems that have that are social insurance systems and on the more competitive liberal side, they have some of the best outcomes. And where national health service type systems or state-funded systems do well, it's in very small countries. So Iceland, Luxembourg, there you can do that. Or even Luxembourg doesn't actually have an NHS type system, but Iceland has something quite close. So in very small political entities, that can work. Otherwise, the competitive system aren't doing that badly. This is a similar measure of, well, this is a healthcare ranking. This is the so-called Healthcare Access and Quality Index, where they look at, firstly, again, avoidable deaths, and they try to adjust that for some other risk factors. And then they look at access, so meaning if you have a healthcare system that is brilliant, but only a few people have access to it, then that system is going to rank badly in this, on this measure here. We can again see that the United Kingdom is not great. It's not even in the top 20. It's again the second worst in Western Europe. Slovakia is, I think, somewhere around 30. Should have included that again. Not great by compared to Western Europe, but not bad by regional standards. But again, Czech Republic doing a bit better on that. And we can see here again the system of the Netherlands doing quite well. So some of the competitive social insurance systems have pretty good results on measures of that kind. And finally, there's the Commonwealth Fund. That is an American healthcare think tank. They publish rankings of healthcare systems every couple of years. And they have one category which is about outcomes, which is the so-called healthcare outcomes category. What I mean by outcomes is outcomes that you can attribute to the healthcare system, so that then they're not looking at, say, population health, because that depends on lifestyle factors a lot. Depends on how many people smoke and how much, whether they exercise, how much alcohol they drink and so forth. They try to look at things that you can attribute to the healthcare system. We can see the United Kingdom with the National Health Service doing badly in every year, and that's a very consistent finding. Whereas, again, at the top, we usually have Switzerland, the Netherlands being quite well represented, although Sweden and Australia are doing very well as well. So it's not that one system is across the board better than any other system, but it's fairly consistent. Whichever measure we're looking at, the National Health Service is not doing great. Now finally, for waiting times, that's an area where we don't have a lot of data. A lot of Western European countries don't collect waiting times data, but that's in a way, that's a good sign. That means they don't consider that an issue. So if you never have a problem with waiting times, then you don't bother to collect the statistics for the same reason that, say, there's no data, as far as I know, for how long you have to wait in the queue in the supermarket. Most of the time, it's not a big issue, therefore there's no data on that. But there is some data for the Netherlands, because they historically had that issue too. And what we see, if we compare the two, is that waiting times are, this is average waiting times in days for various types of procedures where they collect that data, is that you can pretty much, for whatever it is, you're going to wait longer on the NHS than you would on the, in the system of the Netherlands. And I should add that the British data here is from before the pandemic. The Dutch data is from after the pandemic. So the data from the Netherlands here, that already includes the pandemic effect with the increase, the recent increase in waiting times. British data, that's for a normal year. So this means if you compare Dutch healthcare in a pretty bad year to British healthcare in a normal year, it's still the system of the Netherlands that wins. And Insofar as we have data, it's generally true that the more competitive systems, the more market-based systems are doing better when it comes to waiting times. They are just better at getting people quickly to a healthcare provider who can see them. Let's have a look at health expenditure. So we can see pretty much the whole of the OECD, the whole of the developed world, is somewhere between 6 and 12% of GDP. That's spending on healthcare. We can see that the United Kingdom is actually in the top group on that measure. That's worth pointing out because defenders of the National Health Service will often say, well, okay, yes, we don't have brilliant outcomes, but that's just because the system doesn't have enough money. It's just underfunded. Well, not according to this measure. So on spending, it's pretty much above the average, certainly, and a pretty normal figure. In Slovakia, it's clearly very low. It's less than 8% of GDP being spent on healthcare. That is far lower than basically anywhere in Western Europe. And that's nowadays a very low level of spending, even though this is already inflated by the pandemic, at least if it hasn't gone back all the way. And I guess, so these are the measurable outcomes. There are also other kinds of outcomes that if you look at, say, a health economics textbook, they will often say that, okay, if you have a single-payer national health service type system, these systems have downsides. These systems have the problem that healthcare providers are not very responsive to patients, so they don't depend on patient satisfaction for their economic survival, and they will therefore just not be very responsive. They will just be more provider-centered. They will do what's good for them rather than what's good for you. But the textbook will say that systems of that nature have a number of advantages. It's just that if we look at the actual practice, most of the time, these advantages don't really materialize. So one argument, in a theoretical argument, in favor of national health service type systems is that it's easy to control costs. The argument is that in a decentralized system, there is nobody who controls costs overall. So nobody is in charge of the budget. The government, the health minister can try to keep costs down. They can try to somehow change the incentives so that you use the healthcare system less, but they can't directly control it. That depends on the decisions that individual patients and individual doctors make. And there's nobody who is in charge of the overall system. If you have a system like the NHS, you have a single budget that's just imposed, and that's all they can spend. So the finance minister would say, this year we're spending 200 billion, and that's it. And if the service then runs out of money, then, well, they have to cut back on whatever it is that they're providing, or the waiting times then go up. But there is somebody who is in charge of the budget. In theory, it should be easier to control costs in that system, but that's not really what we see. What we see is that in the long term, costs do increase in that system as well. That's I've shown this in this graph here. And it's just that it happens in a more unsteady way. So in more competitive systems, you may have rises year after year. Healthcare costs may go up 2% a year or 3% a year. In a system like the National Health Service, it depends very much on the political mood of the day. So if you look at specifically British data, healthcare spending used to be quite low in the 1980s and 90s, because then it was not a political priority. The governments of those days just weren't that willing to spend much money on healthcare. Then you had Tony Blair in the 2000s, who said, I want to spend loads of money on healthcare. Suddenly the budget exploded. And then you had the Conservative government in the last decade, where spending was, again, slowed down, still increased a bit, but nothing like as much as before. And then now under the current government, we have again big spending increases. So it very much, it's not that these systems contain costs overall, it's just that it depends very much on the political mood of the day. It depends on who's in government and what other priorities they may have. And it's just a more unsteady system, I'd say, rather than a cheaper system. Then supposedly some health economics textbooks will say that if you have a state-run system, if you have a National Health Service type system, what will happen is you will have, say, long-term relationships, because you don't have the issue that, say, that you get in a competitive system where somebody, a health insurer, may come up with a way of saving costs, and then but then people switch to a different insurer, and then their investment will have been for nothing. In a system where, well, everybody is part of the same system, that supposedly doesn't happen. You get greater stability. But that's not really what we see either. What actually happens in the National Health Service is that every time there's a new health secretary, a new health minister, they want to show that they're doing something. And how do they do that? Well, they reorganize something. They dissolve some part of the NHS and build up something new. And it's often quite pointless. It's often not quite clear why are they doing this. Nobody quite understands it. They just want to show, I'm in charge. I've got the political power. I'm doing something. I'm not sitting back. And they want to be in the headlines. They want to be in the news. So they reorganize something. And that's a problem that you get in nationalized systems, that you get these political incentives. Somebody wants to be seen to be doing something. And that's why you get a lot of back and forth. So in the last decade, in the early years of when David Cameron was Prime Minister, they reorganized the part of the health system massively. And then towards the end, almost 10 years later, they just reversed that again. So it was completely pointless, but there is just a constant rotation. No health minister is ever in the job for very long. It's usually less than 2 years, I think, on average. So you have a new guy in charge, and the new guy wants to show, hey, look, I'm doing something, and you get some reforms. But that's the opposite of the stability that the textbook would predict. So even that theoretical advantage, we don't really see that. Supposedly, if all healthcare is provided by one single organization, that should help with having continuity of care, right? It should help with having a system where, say, if you're referred from a general practitioner to a specialist, from a specialist to a hospital, if they're all part of the same organization, the idea is they share information with one another, so that when you show up, the doctor already knows what your problem is. They have some file with your symptoms, and it's all coordinated and integrated. That's not how it works either. So the most common problem that you hear about the NHS is that nothing is really coordinated, nothing is really integrated. So they may be notionally part of the same organization, but as is often the case, even in large organizations, and that can be true in the private sector too, sometimes different departments in an organization don't really talk to each other and don't share information effectively. So the idea that you automatically get integration and coordination just because it's the same organization, that doesn't really hold up either. It doesn't seem to be true. Another theoretical advantage, the textbook will sometimes say, well, if you have a monopoly service, or a monopsony rather, which is a monopoly on the demand side, what that means is that the health service can dictate, say, wages and prices. They can tell the doctors' trade union, look, this is the salary that we offer. If you don't like it, emigrate. There's nowhere else for you to work. We are the only game in town. There's only one National Health Service. This is the salary, take it or leave it. The only alternative is emigrate to Australia. So in theory, that should help keeping salaries in the sector low, but that's not what we see either. What we actually see is that the doctors often go on strike when they know that the government is unpopular. Why? Because they know if there's, say, trouble in the hospital sector with waiting times going up or whatever, the public will not blame the doctors for that. They will blame the government, and therefore it's just easier for the government to buy them off, say, okay, you get your pay rise, and therefore it's not really, yes, there may be a monopsony, but you get these political power plays where it depends on who exactly is in government, are they trusted on healthcare, are they popular, and you get this politicized process which isn't really better than a competitive process either. And Well, in theory, there is the idea that when healthcare is organized by the state is somehow working for the common good. That's not really true either. What does happen is that politicians just play politics with the health system. So, for example, I remember a paper which looked at how hospital closures work, because we sometimes have overcapacity. Some hospitals are too big. Parts of them need to be closed down, or sometimes an entire hospital has to be shut down. That's always politically unpopular. And that paper tried to model why does this happen in some places but not others? How do politicians make these decisions? And it turned out hospitals rarely close in well, what's called a marginal seat, which is a part of the country that sometimes votes Labour, sometimes votes Conservative, and both parties see that as a battleground. They want to win that part of the country. And places like that are often privileged when it comes to public investment, because governments want to throw money at it, because they want to win voters there. Whereas places that always vote for the same party, it's much more likely that a hospital is closed in those places. Why? Well, say, imagine you're a Conservative government and you're closing a hospital in an area where they always vote Labour. It makes sense for you to think, well, they're not going to vote for me anyway, so I don't mind being unpopular with these people. They hate me anyway, so I might as well close their hospitals. And the same can be true in reverse. Say if you're a Conservative government and there's some part of the country that always votes Conservative, you can say, well, these voters, I can take them for granted. I can shut their hospital, they'll vote for me anyway. And therefore, it's often driven by political incentives. I don't see how that is in any way better than a more competitive system, or than yeah, well, pure pursuit of the profit motive. And finally, I'll end with the question, social health insurance, the kind of system that I'm broadly in favor of, are those systems competitive? Are they market-based? That goes back to what I said earlier, not automatically, depends on how you do it. So it depends on the specifics. From what I understand, in this country, 2004 to 2006, the government of that period was trying to make it competitive. I'm less sure about what happened since then. I hear nothing good, but that's basically the distinction. It's not that a social insurance system is automatically market-based. So the original, it certainly wasn't originally. The first model of this type is the old Otto von Bismarck system from the 1880s, from 1883. That was not meant to be a competitive system. The idea wasn't to have competition between health insurers or healthcare providers. In the early days, in the Bismarck days, people couldn't even choose the health insurer. It was like today in Austria still, where you were just allocated an insurer on the basis of either the industry you work for or the region you live in. In a system like that, a social health insurance system is not competitive, but it can be. You can turn it into a competitive system if you want to. So in the German case, that freedom of choice for insurers was introduced in the 1990s, very late in the day. The system was over 100 years old already at the time, but it could be done. And once they introduced that freedom of choice, there was a massive consolidation process. So you could see people were shopping around a bit for looking for a cheaper or better insurer. Some of the small ones had to close down, or rather they were bought up or merged with others. So a system like that can be made competitive. It isn't automatically, but you can do it that way if you want to. And there also need to be meaningful differences between different health insurers. If you have again, if you have, say, 3, 5, 10, 50, or 100 different companies, but they all do the same thing, then you don't have competition. You need to give them, if you want to make a system like that competitive, you need to give them the freedom to offer things that are different from each other, and they need to have the freedom to have different arrangements between healthcare providers, so that, for example, you could have a network system. Say one insurer says, I contract very selectively, only the best hospitals get a contract with me. Another one saying, yeah, I do a deal with all of them, and then you choose where you want to go to. And in that case, it would make a real difference whether you choose the first one, the network insurer, or the all-encompassing insurer. And in that case, you can make a system like that competitive if you give the different actors within the system freedom of contract, if you give them the freedom to arrange things in the way they see fit. And of course, you need to have a market that is contestable, meaning there must be the possibility of entry and exit. So it must be possible to set up a new company, a new health insurer, a new hospital, new clinic, whatever it is, and there has to be a possibility of a badly performing one exiting the market. Doesn't have to mean that you literally shut it down, but it can be in the form of a takeover. And that would be the way to make a system, a social insurance system, competitive, even if it isn't automatically. As I said in the beginning, I don't know nearly enough about the system of this country to say anything meaningful about. I'm in no position to come up with, say, a 10-point plan saying this is what should happen. But what I would say is a national health service is definitely not the alternative. Whatever problem the system has, first of all, I would look at, can it be turned into a more competitive system? Can it be turned into something that looks more like what they have in the Netherlands, that looks more like what they have in Switzerland, competitive, market-based versions of social insurance, and when all else fails, then it would be time to have a look maybe at other options. I will end on that note. I've been talking for too long already. Thank you.